Okay, welcome everybody. Sorry, I think I was on mute there. Welcome to the broadcast, Maximising Your Impact and Getting What You Want Ethically and Honestly. So what the normal procedure is for my webinars at least is that I will leave time at the end for you to answer any questions or ask any questions, I should say. So if you go to the box, the chat box there, you can actually type in your question at any time during the presentation, and I will deal with that in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the presentation. That way I can keep the flow of the presentation continuing, and then we can finish up at the end with a number of questions that you'll have about your. So what I suggest you do is to write your questions down the moment you think about them and not leave them to the end. So that's the first key thing. So let's start the process. And I guess there are a couple of objectives that I'd like to achieve out of this short, sharp session. And I noticed from the attendance list we've got people from the private sector, the public sector, we've got people from international, we've got local, wherever you are, welcome. But I guess it underlines the issue that we're all in the business of influencing, no matter who we are or where we are. Whole notice that operandi in life is actually about persuading other people about something. So let's talk about that. I've put together a model in my new book, the New Influencing Toolkit, which basically gives you a diagnostic to be able to determine your favoured influencing strategy. And I've identified or built a model up that looks at 4 influencing strategies, and I'm going to share that with you in this session now so that you can actually look at it and say, well, I think I'm probably more likely to favour that strategy than this one here, but it nevertheless will give you the 4 particular styles or strategies. Now, the interesting thing about this is that when you have to influence other people, it's highly likely that other people will have different strategies to the strategy that you favour. And what we tend to do is we tend to try to persuade or influence other people based on how we like to be influenced. And that in itself is a bit of a problem because we're not always going to hit the mark unless, of course, we're trying to influence or persuade somebody that thinks like we do. So hopefully this will broaden your particular outlook as to how you might go about influencing other people, whether it's in a one-on-one situation, whether it's a negotiation, whether it's actually a presentation, whether it's during a meeting, whatever the situation, these strategies are applicable right across the board. I guess the second thing that I hope that you can get out of the presentation is some practical tools to maximise your capacity to influence. Now in the book there are 64 tools, and that's why we call it the New Influencing Toolkit. There are 64 tools. Now obviously I don't have time to go through 64, but I will go through at least a dozen for you today. So on those areas that you think perhaps I'm not terribly influential, I'm a bit weak in these strategies, I'll give you some tools that you can apply immediately. So they're the 2 things that we hope you'll get from the presentation today. So having a look at these 4 leaders, and I'm going to use these leaders, they're all famous leaders. There's 3 of them are dead and 1's still alive. And if you actually look at those 4 leaders, there are a number of things they've got in common. Well, I guess the first thing they've all got in common is they're famous. We all at least recognise their faces if we can't necessarily put a name to them. So that's the first important commonality. The second commonality is that they're all highly controversial. People either love them or dislike them. There's very little in between, and I've selected these people for the third common reason. They have been or are still highly influential in their own sphere. So I'll use these 4 people to explain the 4 influencing strategies so that you can get a better handle on those particular individuals. So at the top we've got former Vice President of the United States Al Gore and climate change activist. We've got former Great Britain Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. We've got Dr. Martin Luther King, the human rights activist of the 1960s, and Mother Teresa, who obviously did a lot of good for the homeless people, poor people of Calcutta and other parts of the world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these four as we go through the presentation. Now, before we go any further, I think it's very, very important that we define exactly what I mean by influence, because I think it's true that different people have got different definitions of influence or different concepts or ideas, and I think it's extremely important we understand what I mean by influence before we go any further. And I define it as simply the power to make other people agree with your opinions or get them to do what you want ethically and willingly. Now, the key words there is power. So any form of influence requires some source of power, and we'll talk about some of that in the presentation. But the most important thing in this definition is the two words willingly and ethically. So this is getting people to do things because they want to do them, not only because you want them to do it. And ethically meaning you're doing it in a transparent, open way and not an underhanded, manipulative way. So it's very important we understand that. So influencing in this sense is a very ethical, natural, normal human phenomenon. But it's not about being underhanded, tricky or sneaky. None of that applies in this case. So I think that's very important before we get underway. The other point I'd make before I share with you my model of influencing is this, and I've said it a couple of times already, and that is that we are all in the business of influence. Every single one of us is trying to influence somebody about something at some time in some way, whether it's a father talking to his teenage daughter, whether it's a CEO trying to convince the board of directors about a particular strategy, whether it is an employee who is trying to influence another employee to see things their way. All of those situations require influence, and every single day we are either on the receiving end of somebody trying to persuade or influence us, or we in turn are trying to persuade or influence other people. So it's a reality, and what I'm trying to do is to help you develop some skills in something that's clearly a reality. Now, there are three important concepts that need to be considered when we're talking about influence. One of these concepts is that each of us has our own preferred style and approach. And what happens is that we tend to influence other people based on our preferred style and approach, and we do this often subconsciously. So, for example, if you like to influence people with fact and logic, you will go ahead and try and do that. So that's the first important thing. And if you get the book and you do the diagnostic, it'll give you a very clear picture of your influencing style and approach. So the first variable is that. And the other interesting thing about influencing variables, or particularly preferred style and approach, is that we tend to influence other people based on how we like to be influenced. So obviously if I like to be influenced by fact, logic and structure, then I'm going to have a tendency to influence other people that way. The second variable, of course, is the person that we're trying to influence. And that might be one person, or it might be 1,000 people, or it could be a serious tens of thousands of people. The other person or persons have, of course, their own preferential way of wanting to be influenced. So therefore, if we can tailor our message to dovetail into their particular preferred style, we're likely to be far more influential because we're basically trying to influence other people the way they want to be influenced. In a one-on-one situation, it's about trying to understand who we're attempting to influence and what their style is. But when we have a large group of people, such as giving a presentation, we actually have to use all four strategies. And by using all four strategies, we're likely to hit the mark at some point in the presentation with everybody that happens to be in the room. And the third variable, of course, is the context. The context meaning the situation that we're in. Different situations require different forms of influence. So, for example, if we need to take a team with us on a journey, then we need to use a more collaborative strategy. And that would be applicable in a case where we want everybody completely committed to a particular course of action. So those three are critical, and when we align those three, we are likely to be at our very, very best. And the opposite's true, that when those three aren't aligned, we'll tend to miss the mark with our ability to persuade other people. Okay, so here is the influencing framework, and I'll share this with you. I'll talk about it, give you some examples, and then we'll move on to, or back to those four famous historical figures, each of which has a preferred strategy in one of these four areas. So the first thing you'll notice is that in the influencing framework there is up the top a push and pull style. So let me explain that for you and what that means. Basically, a person who likes to influence using a push style is usually very direct. They like to give information, they like to present information, they like to block or shut out other counter views. They will take they will take the idea to the person rather than get the person to come to the idea. So it's very much a directive style, and you might like to think about where you fit in here. Are you like that, or do you like more of the pull style, which is about enabling, taking other people with you, testing approaches, seeking out information and building upon it from other people, basically opening up possibilities and discussion points. So each of us have a tendency to be more push or pull in terms of our style. And you can see here on the framework that investigation and motivation are push styles, whereas calculation and collaboration is more the push style. Now, the other aspect of this, of course, is that down here we have a logical approach and an emotional approach. And whilst most of us like to think that we're quite logical, the reality is that I find there are a lot of people who are influenced by emotion. And I think that it's very important for us to acknowledge that there are two types of approaches here. There's the logical and the emotional. So the logical style is very much based on logic, fact, giving the evidence, using structure, using quantitative data, being rational. And the emotional style, on the other hand, is about feelings and about perceptions, basically trying to influence people by using values, being flexible, and basically trying to generate influence by building people's morale. So you can see there that the investigation and the calculation strategy are logical, and the motivation and collaboration are emotional approaches. So these are the four styles that I'm going to spend a bit of time covering, but I just needed you to understand the context of those. I've used these words because, as best as I possibly can, they describe the kind of action required in order to be influential. So let's actually look at that a little bit further. what I've done here now is I've built this up a little bit to show you that within those 4 particular strategies, there are 4 competencies. So overall in my model there are 16 competencies of influence, 4 for each of the strategies. And you can just have a quick glance through all of those. I won't go into great detail, we just don't have time to do that, but of course I go into that in great depth in my book. But you'll notice that a lot of those competencies very much explain the strategy that's required. So for example, just as a quick example, if I'm going to be motivational, which is of course in the bottom left-hand corner, which is an emotional approach using a push style, I'm going to need to communicate a clear vision, a compelling, inspirational vision. So that would be one of the competencies required of somebody who happens to use the motivation strategy to influence other people. So that's the model, and what happens is that the diagnostic actually gives you scores around these 16 competencies. They give you scores around these 4 strategies. They give you scores around the push, pull, and logical and emotional approaches. So it gives you a very comprehensive framework to be able to build upon your capacity to influence other people. Okay, let's move on. So the first person or the first style we'll look at is, and I use the word Inquisitive Investigator because the Inquisitive Investigator, probably the inquisitive word at least, kind of describes the sort of behaviour that this person would exhibit. So these people, when they like to influence other people, will tend to use facts and figures. They will assertively advance their argument, and they'll tend to use logic to persuade. So they'll usually do that in a reasonably forthright way as well. So a classic example of somebody who, or a particular skill that requires investigation in terms of influence, would be a debater. Somebody that's good at debating would have a tendency to be abreast of the facts and the figures, be able to rebut the arguments of the opposition, and be able to forcefully and clearly and in a structured way put forward a compelling view based on facts and figures. So a typical example of somebody like that, of course, would be Al Gore, as I said before, former Vice President of the United States and climate change activist. Al Gore was a devastating debater when he was in the White House, and he would win his debates because he'd do a lot of preparation, he'd do a lot of homework, he'd have a lot of facts and figures to back up a very strong case. Al Gore, when you might recall, when he first left the White House, brought out a compelling video called The Inconvenient Truth, but basically talking about the case for a need for action on climate change. And throughout that presentation he used facts and figures, charts and graphs and statistics to make his case. So he very much did use the investigator strategy in order to convince other people of the need for action on climate change. So that was his style, that was his approach, and of course he still uses that. And one would say probably uses that very effectively. So if you were looking at people who were investigators in terms of people in careers, a typical example would be a police officer. A police officer tends to collect their evidence. They put that into some form of report or brief. The evidence then perhaps becomes a conviction, or at least somebody's charged. It goes before a court of law, and assuming the evidence is compelling, the person that's convicted the person charged is often convicted. Scientists and researchers, of course, use this style very much. They use this approach, they develop a hypothesis, they go out and test that hypothesis, they write a thesis on that and basically are able to influence science based on using investigation as a strategy. So there's two examples of occupations that would tend to favour the influencing strategy. So when would you use it? I would suggest that in any situation in the workplace where there are incidents such as safety incidents or harassment incidents that require further investigation, then this would be the way to influence, because whoever it was that was called upon to investigate these incidents, whether it's a occupational health and safety issue or perhaps a bullying issue, whoever it was investigating this would actually go in and do their investigation. So they would get their facts and figures, they might interview several people, they would look at how consistent it was with the workplace policies, they might look at legislation and basically make a recommendation based on their investigation. So influencing using investigation for workplace incidents can be very, very effective. For large-scale change initiatives where you want to take people with you, it's not quite so good, because in these instances here, people have to understand the rationale of why something is the way it is. They don't need a whole bunch of facts and figures. They just need a clear understanding of why the organisation is moving in the direction that it is, particularly when you need to take the organisation with you. So in those cases, it probably isn't going to be all that effective. The timing for that would be incorrect or it would be wrong. So, moving on, if we now look at the clear calculation unfortunately conjures up these views of being underhanded and conceited, but once I explain this to you, you'll understand why I've used the word calculation. So calculators are people, when they're influencing, who tend to look at promoting the positives of a proposal, and there's a tendency to highlight the weaknesses. So in other words, they put a compelling case for change and also explain the pitfalls of not changing, so that people are put into a position where they clearly can see the rationale for the change and equally can see the limitations of not changing. So it's kind of like leveraging people and their position. A very good example of that would be a case where recently I was walking past a store in Australia called Harvey Norman's, which had laptops on sale, and it had a sign out the front saying laptops for sale 40% off, which of course is a pretty interesting, it certainly got me in at least. I walked in the store and there was another sign just inside the door saying must purchase by the close of business today. So what this retail outlet were doing was using calculation to influence buyers' behaviour. So obviously the positive was the 40% on the discount, but also the negative was that people had to make a decision today. So retail outlets are classic examples of outlets that use calculation as an influencing strategy to get us to purchase. So it can be very, very effective. So when it's used the right way. Probably a very good example in historical terms would be the former Great Britain Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. People actually felt that they knew whether they were for or against her. She had a very clear approach, and people either disliked her or liked her. There wasn't too much in between. Everybody had an opinion. And part of the reason for that was that she let people know where they stood, because she was very clear about arguing for her particular proposals, and at the same level would be very prepared to actually denigrate counter views to her proposals. So very, very strong in that area. And in fact, if you think about teachers that taught you at school and ones that you really respected, I can guarantee to you that they probably used calculation as their influencing strategy. Maybe they didn't realise what they were doing, but they were the sort of teachers where you sort of knew where you stood. You knew that if you stepped over this line, this would happen to you, but if you stayed on this side, everything would be fine. So you were very clear about where you stood with that particular teacher. And it's the same with anybody that likes to influence using calculation. You're very clear, and these people will tend to promote key performance indicators. They will have a tendency to talk about key performance indicators and give feedback about whether people are actually meeting, exceeding, or not meeting key performance indicators. So typical examples, as I said before, would be a salesperson who will have a tendency of leveraging you and me by basically saying, here are the positives about this particular product or service. However, here are the negatives of not going down this road and using this. So we'd kind of be leveraged. So retailers, as I said, use this calculation strategy very much in terms of their advertising and how they might promote to us. Financial advisors do the same thing. They'll often talk about this fantastic deal. It's a once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity. But on the other hand, if you miss it, here are the pitfalls and downfalls that we might have. Animal trainers. It wasn't long ago that I took my youngest daughter to the circus. And when we were at the circus, one of the features of the circus was the animals that went round, the ponies and so forth. And there was a trainer there who had a whip in one hand and some treats in the other. And the trainer would give the circus animal a treat if they did the right thing. And of course they get a whip if they did the wrong thing. So animal trainers very much use calculation as a form of influence. And as I mentioned before, teachers, good teachers, often have the capacity to calculate and use pros and cons in terms of being able to motivate and influence their students. So, what situations in the workplace are ideal for this? Well, when you're trying to influence people about a new system, say for example a new computer system, or some form of process that you're using which is different to what was previously used, people want to know what the positives are. Why are we changing? What are the advantages of the change on the one hand, and equally, what are the disadvantages of not changing? In other words, if we stay where we are using the current system, what will be the downfalls? What are the limitations of that? So if that's explained clearly to people, then they have a rationale, they have an understanding. And of course it's using logic, as I mentioned earlier, to actually make a case for change. So that would be where you could use it very effectively. But on the other hand, where you wouldn't use it is situations where there's a very vague direction. We really have no clarity in terms of what the proposal is. So the very first thing that has to be explained to people in these circumstances is what you're proposing. Once you explain what you're proposing, then people can grasp the positives and the negatives around that change, but explaining to people the pros of the proposal without really knowing what it is that you're proposing will fall on deaf ears. So it's being clear about what's being proposed to start with. Moving right along, now the difference we have now is that the first two that I shared with you, that is the investigation and the calculation strategy, those two strategies were the so-called above the line. In other words, they used logic to make the point. The next two I'm going to share with you are the emotional approaches. So these two don't use logic anymore, but rather tug at the heartstrings. And so let's have a look at the difference. Now, what do motivators do? Motivators have a tendency to use emotions to influence. So normally they're big picture thinkers. So great entrepreneurs who often have a clear vision about what they're trying to achieve. So a Sir Richard Branson, for example, a very clear picture of where he is wanting to go will often motivate and influence other people to come along on the journey with him. So there's a tendency for motivators not to be strong on detail, but to be able to paint an inspiring and compelling vision of the future and be able to take other people with them. So they often won't use fact and logic, but rather get people excited about a positive future. And a good example of that, as you can see from the picture there, a very good example is Martin Luther King. I Have a Dream. Any of you have seen his, go to YouTube and have a look at the video. It's a very compelling speech that moved a nation, it moved a generation. It had enormous impact, and he used motivation as his strategy. So, as I said, entrepreneurs, advertising executives, they only have a split second to catch our attention. And in order to do that, they need to tug at our heartstrings and use values, use beliefs. Artistic directors also have that obligation to remind people of the big picture and to be able to really remind people and distill down a message into a very simple and compelling argument. So when we're developing a new strategic direction, we want to take people with us, and any vision statement, although to an extent it can be based on logic, but any vision statement must have some inspiration from a motivational point of view. In other words, we must get excited about reading it or hearing it or thinking about the possibilities of what that actually means for us and for the organisation. So it's again not going to be helpful if people don't understand the rationale. So if people are, for example, if you're going to introduce budget cuts, cost-cutting measures in your business, it's no good trying to influence people initially by using motivation. People need to understand why the budget cuts are being made, what that means for them, and then once that's been done, you can change your influencing style later, but people need to understand the reason for that initially. Now, the last one before we look at some strategies is collaboration. And collaborators will tend to influence people again by emotion, but the difference between the collegial collaborator and the mindful motivator is that the collegial collaborator will tend to motivate people by bringing the team together. So they'll have a tendency to galvanize a team towards a common cause, whereas the motivators will galvanize the individuals to a common cause. So collaborators, by virtue of their influencing strategy, will be very good at bringing teams together and keeping teams focused on what they need to do. So they'll be mindful of fractures in the team, and they'll be very, very clear about, any sort of opportunity to bring the team together. So by bringing a team together, you can achieve a lot of good. And probably a great example of that in historical terms is Mother Teresa, who was enormously influential in the poor parts of Calcutta and other poverty-stricken parts of the world by marshalling resources, very, very good at stakeholder management, bringing coalitions of people on board to achieve a very big picture need. So she was outstanding at that, and bringing along people to buy into this particular vision that she had for the poor people on the streets in Calcutta and other places. So extremely good at that, and can't think of a better example of somebody who would be using collaborator as an influencing strategy. So conductors of orchestras, if you think about it, are very much in the collaborative mode. They have no musical instrument. They're actually trying to collaborate with a bunch of musicians to create a beautiful sound. So they need to collaborate. Their job is collaboration. Funeral directors have to deal with a whole bunch of, various stakeholders very sensitively, and obviously a good funeral director will use collaboration as an influencing strategy. Directors and choreographers need to make sure that they bring everybody along on the journey of achieving a great production. They need to make sure that everybody's on the same page and working together. So that would be a number of examples where you would use that. So where you would use that in the workplace, a good example is where you've got very divergent views. So if, for example, in your team at work you've got some very strong views one way or the other, it's a very good opportunity for you to air those views and to do it in a constructive way in a forum or a room, and give both sides an opportunity to air their views in a respectful environment. And often what that will do is it'll break down any barriers. At least there'll be an understanding about why people feel the way they do. They might not necessarily agree, but by not doing that, and I find often leaders do this, is they sort of sweep these differences under the carpet. All that simply does is solidify and galvanise these views, and it does nothing to bring the team together, so you're better off bringing it out in the open. So if people need to know more about the logic and rationale behind a decision, then they need to know the facts. Asking people to collaborate is really the wrong strategy in this circumstance. Asking people how they might implement the particular strategies once they understand the facts associated with a new system is absolutely the right way to go. But they need to understand why we're doing something, and what's in it for people, and they need to understand the rationale of that. So the logic has to come first before we start to use collaboration. Okay, let's move on, and I'm conscious of the fact that we might have a few questions. So again, as I said before, please type your questions in the question box there, and I'll deal with those very shortly. So what I want to do now is just give you a quick overview of some different tools that you can use for the 4 influencing styles, and then finish up answering a few questions. So if you wanted to improve your ability to influence using investigation, third-party endorsement is a great way to do that. In other words, get somebody who's an authority, a respected figure in that particular area, to either use them as a quote, get them involved in the conversation, and so forth, because that's what people do. For example, if you look at the back of a book, you'll often find there are testimonials or endorsements. Testimonials and endorsements from people who are prominent in the field add weight to the buying decision. Structured interviews, if you need to go out and talk to people in the workplace and do an investigation, a better way of bolstering up your report is to actually make those interviews consistent. In other words, asking everybody exactly the same questions so that your methodology has got some validity to it. Conducting a survey. So any surveys, if they're done reasonably well, has a form of influence in terms of its outcome. And a process map, and there's a process map on your screen there, actually mapping out a process and actually looking at the steps in a process and talking about the various pitfalls that might occur in the process and how that process can be improved can be a very useful way to actually use influence in an investigative way. So for calculation, you've got a number of different factors or ways of being able to do this. a cost-benefit analysis is one of the best ways. So if you're going to spend money or proposing to spend money and you're trying to influence upwards to your boss, one of the best ways of doing that is to actually say that here are the costs and here are the benefits, and hopefully the benefits outweigh the costs. If they do, you're likely to get a fair hearing, and if they don't, of course, you won't. So using a cost-benefit analysis can be a very effective calculation tool. Kurt Lewin's force field analysis can be highly effective as well. And what that means is simply looking at all the driving forces for a proposal and drawing those down on the left-hand side of a piece of paper or on a butcher's paper or on a wherever it is, and on the right-hand side all the restraining forces. These are all the forces that are going to stop the proposal from taking shape and taking form. And actually working with a group of people on how to maximize the driving forces, how to minimize the constraining forces. And by doing that collaboratively, you're applying two influencing strategies. One, of course, is calculation, but the other one is collaboration. So it can be very powerful when it's done in a group. And after action reviews, a debrief on any particular action that's been taken can be a very powerful strategy that's often neglected in the workplace, I find, regrettably. So, what can you do in order to motivate people? And this is, of course, about motivating people to a common cause. A couple of key things that might work for you. One way is to use what I call a team values charter. So you've formed a new team and you ask each individual around the table 4 clear questions. You actually ask them to write down the responses to these 4 questions so that they can actually consider them. Question 1 is, if you had one value that you considered to be critically important in working in this team, what would it be? Question 2, define what that value means to you. Question 3, why is that value important? And question 4, what behaviours would demonstrate that value? Now, if you get everybody to write those down and then you actually ask people to present based on those 4 questions, you get a very powerful discussion happening and you've created a series of values which you can use as a charter to motivate people to stay on track. And that can be very powerful. There's the GROW model. GROW stands for goal, R for reality, O for options, W for where to from here. The GROW model can be a very effective way to get people to think about the answer without you spoon feeding them. So, for example, what are you trying to achieve? Goal. What's your current barriers that are preventing you from achieving that goal? R. What are your options for overcoming those barriers? O. And what will you do next? W. Can be a very powerful way to empower and enable other people to solve their own particular problems. Many of you would be good and talented storytellers, and you don't have to be a good and talented storyteller, but telling a story is a powerful way of getting people to think differently about a particular course of action. Storytelling, particularly when you talk about things that you have actually done wrong in the past, can be a very powerful lesson. And good news stories, going around the room and starting your meetings with wins for the week, can be a very powerful and uplifting way of starting a meeting rather than wallowing around in the problems initially. We're going to do that anyway, so why don't we talk about some of the wins for the week. Collaboration, finally, some key things that you might consider using. So one of the strategies, and the late Stephen Covey talks about this in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He talks about beginning with the end in mind. So if you're collaborating a discussion, which is really facilitating a discussion, you should start the discussion by saying, at the end of this discussion, this is what I'm after, and then allow the discussion to take its natural course. And when it goes off track, is every now and again say in the meeting, come back to your original end in mind to keep everybody on track. So you become very focused on the outcome, whereas the team might very much focus on how they get there. Any effective feedback can be collaborative because you're expecting others to contribute to that feedback process. So you might actually start any feedback by asking people how they think they went in a particular situation or project. Using a problem-solving approach where you're actually looking at things in as a way of solving an issue, and doing that in a very collaborative team approach obviously can be a very influential approach once everybody agrees with the course of action. And one of the most powerful and simple ways is just letting people know that you've listened to them. Often when you demonstrate to people that you've listened to them, they'll often spend time listening to you, which of course means that they're very receptive and open to be persuaded. So there are some strategies. As I said in the book, there are 60 plus tools that you can actually use and draw upon. Just 3 quick plugs before I get to questions. I just wanted to say to you that when you fill out that particular diagnostic in my book, it can be very insightful, but you remember you're filling it out for yourself. So one of the things you might like to consider is doing a 360-degree feedback report on yourself or one of your team members, and this can be based on the 4 influencing strategies model I've shared with you. So if you are interested in doing that with, say, your management team, then contact me and I'm sure we can arrange that very easily for you. So we have a tool available for 360, which can be very useful. Another thing that I'd like to mention to you is that if you are interested in actually your management team, or there's a group of you in your workplace that are very interested in building up your influence, they could be salespeople, they could be managers, whoever they might be at whatever level, I already have a one-day workshop that's available that can be very useful. They get a copy of the book in the charge, and we go through what I've pretty much gone through with you today on the day. So that can be very useful, and we'd tailor the examples to fit your workplace. And I guess finally, the book, The New Influencing Toolkit, is available on Amazon, or it's available through my website. And if you go, and you'll receive a copy, by the way, of these slides, and you can go to either of those 2 places and purchase the book. It's a hardcover and nicely presented, and you can learn more about influencing that way. So that's pretty much the plug. Now I have a question here that I'd like to respond to, and if you've got any other questions, go for your life, put them into the question box, and I'll be more than happy to do what I can to answer those. And of course, at the end of the presentation, you've got my email address there. You can send me an email, and I'm more than happy to try to respond to that offline. We've got a question here around presentations, and this question is asking, how do I influence when I'm giving presentations to large groups of people that I am unfamiliar with? Okay, well, I think it's a good question. I think a lot of us have to do that. I have to do that all the time. And when you're going to have to give a presentation, it's normally about influencing somebody or a group of people about something. My strong suggestion is that when you have to do a presentation to a large group of people, you really can know one thing for certain, that the group of people who have come to your presentation probably fall into each of the 4 quadrants that we went through. So there'll be some investigators in the room, there'll be some collaborators in the room, there'll be some motivators in the room, and there'll be some calculators in the room. So knowing that, the whole objective should be around presenting to them and tailoring your presentation to fit all 4 strategies. If you do that, you're likely to be highly influential. Let me give you an example. So I'm going to suggest a proposal, and I've got a group of people in the room, and let's say I've got 100 people in the room, and I'm making a case. Probably the very first thing I should do is state clearly some facts and figures. So what I need to do is to state the current situation, the status quo. I need to explain what's actually happening right now. And by doing that, what I'm using is investigation. So I might also state what I might have learned from my own investigations about the matter as well. So I might have read up on this, I might have talked to an expert, I might have done some other things. So I can state some logic around that is going to be critically important, because the audience are going to appreciate the fact that I'm across the detail and the facts around the situation. They need to know that I know that information. I might then decide to talk about the compelling arguments, and I might just use some dot points if I'm using PowerPoint. I might talk about 3 or 4 compelling arguments around why my proposal is critical to the audience or whoever it might be targeted at. It's a common mistake to assume that your audience understands what the pros and cons are of a proposal. Don't make that mistake. I might also have another slide which will talk about some of the sort of implications of not changing. So in other words, if the proposal doesn't get up, or there's some reason why we shouldn't propose this, I should talk about those things in terms of how that'll impact on the target audience. So now the audience has some facts, and they have some driving reasons for change and some reasons to change based on staying where they are. I might then go below the line, so to speak, and talk about how it might link in with the strategic vision of the organisation. So how does my proposal, how is it consistent with the values of the organisation? So I need to make a strong case for that so that people can see where it fits. And I also, at some stage in my presentation, probably need to give people an opportunity to have their say. So I want input. By asking for input and gaining input, what I'm actually doing is I'm involving them in my presentation. And by doing that, I'm actually going to be more influential because I'm involving people in the change process, particularly if I'm asking people for their point of view. I'm actually asking people to collaborate with me about the future. Now, you can imagine if I used all 4 of those in my presentation, and I did that consciously, I'm likely to be far more influential, and I'm likely to be able to persuade a lot more people than I would if I just continued to bang on with my particular strategy. And if I did that, I'm not going to meet the mark with everybody in the room, because as I said before, there are 3 variables. There's yourself in terms of your own style. There is the other persons. In this case, we've got a lot of people in the room. And there is the situation or the context. And the situation or the context is that I'm trying to influence this group of people about something. So I hope that's sort of answered the question around which approach. I've got another question here around managing upwards and how can I best manage upwards using the 4 influencing styles. Okay, thanks for the question. I think the principles apply. I think the important thing is to think about your boss in terms of where they fit in to the new influencing toolkit framework. So what are they? How do they like to be influenced? And then, of course, once I know that, then I should be couching my particular proposals with that style. So instead of using all 4 as I would if I had a larger group, in this case I would probably use 1, and I would probably use it quite extensively, because I know that my boss is influenced and favours that particular style. So there would be a tendency for me to try one approach, and you'll find that you should be quite influential if your style resonates with your boss's style. All right, so it doesn't look like we've got any other questions. As I said to you before, if you do have any, by all means send me an email at tim@winnersatwork.com.au. More than happy to continue the conversation with you individually. If you have any questions or any queries about any of the things that I can offer you, can I thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your participation in the broadcast. Thank you for taking the time, and valuable time, and I appreciate it. Hopefully you've got a little bit more insight into how you may influence other people, and perhaps some tools about how you go about that. So thank you once again, one and all, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue with you in the future. Thank you.